Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Argentina for the G20 meetings after visits to several European Union countries. What's the deal after the charm offensive of China's top diplomat? And I get up and close with former French Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin, who was quite frank about his views on world trade and cooperation and the speed of projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We begin today's program in Buenos Aires, where Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi will attend this year's G20 meetings. He has just wrapped up his visit to France, Spain, and Portugal before coming to Argentina. So what is the outcome of his visits earlier in Europe? How will G20 members coordinate their policies on global trade and other diplomatic hotspots, such as the Iran nuclear deal and the Korean Peninsula tensions? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Journey to boost cooperation. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is attending the 2018 G20 meeting of Foreign Affairs Ministers in Argentina. When meeting with Argentine Foreign Minister Jorge Fauri, Wang said that bilateral ties are stable and that China will support Argentina as a South American country promotes stability and development. Before Argentina, Wang also visited France, Spain, and Portugal. During his travels, Wang said China is ready to boost cooperation with Europe.
My visit is the first one by a foreign affairs minister after the swearing-in of the new Chinese government, and we are in the context of the 15th anniversary of the establishment of the Strategic Cooperation Agreement between China and the European Union. So we would like to send a very clear signal that we intend to strengthen our cooperation strategy and partnership within the context of global cooperation.
China's foreign minister says he's reached important agreements with the leaders of the three countries. He added more and more European countries are supporting China's Belt and Road Initiative, and that China and the EU are working together to defend the global free trade system based on the rules of the World Trade Organization. Wang will now attend the G20 ministerial meeting and will meet with Argentine President Mauricio Macri. The trip signals Beijing's willingness to maintain sound and stable international relations.
For more on Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Europe, we are joined in our Beijing studio Professor Liu Baocheng, the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. And also in Paris, we have Joab Toker, Professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. In London, we invited Ian Begg, a Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and also Associate Fellow at the Chatham House. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with you, Mr. Toker. Obviously, for Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councillor's trip to Europe, there are several things that are on people's hands. First of all, it is the Iran nuclear deal. How much do you think this kind of exchange will be able to shore up the belief both sides could have about the deal's future?
To some significant extent. As a matter of fact, we're just at the beginning of this new chapter, which had been signaled out by President Trump's announcement 10 days ago. But this is extremely important, I would say, not only in the very immediate sense of what's going to happen over the coming few weeks or months, but perhaps over the entire scene related to the arrival of Mr. Trump at the White House and this new American policy. I would even say, in terms of diplomacy, sort of a new language or new diplomatic language or new nuances of language we have never been accustomed to before, and we are getting accustomed to. So my feeling is that over the coming few weeks, we are now almost a year and a half into the Trump presidency.
All right. The thing is not about the Trump presidency. What we're talking about here is China-European relations. My question rather to you, Professor Begg, also is about that. How much do you think China and the EU countries be able to work together, whether on the Iranian nuclear deal or some of the other issues? Will that so-called united front, if there is any, gonna be enough to hold anything still?
Well, they're certainly going to try, because what Trump's method of working is to throw bombshells into the international system. He's done it with Korea, he's done it with tariff suggestions, now he's done it with the Iran deal. The difficulty that everybody else has at that point is that if Trump brings the full power of the American sanctions to bear on European companies, on Chinese companies, it's all very well for China and Europe to cooperate at the political level, but if their companies are fearful of losing US markets and say, well, okay, we understand why you want to maintain the deal with Iran, but if we face fines for trading with Iran, are you, the European and Chinese governments, going to compensate us? Because without that, companies simply won't follow the lead taken by their governments. And that puts the governments themselves in a very difficult position, because they then have to choose between pursuing the deal they want, which they think makes sense, which is good for world peace, and the very difficult obstacle of a rather maverick inhabitant of the White House who thinks otherwise.
Well, Professor Liu, we have already heard that Angela Merkel is to visit China the week. But at the same time, she earlier said it is impossible to compensate the big corporations, multilaterals, as a result of the sanctions coming from the U.S. side toward any company dealing with Iran, maybe small and medium-sized companies. So with that in mind, do you think this is still possible that China and the EU countries, together with other signatories of the Iran nuclear deal, be able to hold that deal?
Well, I think it's really a matter of whether it's a strategy or expediency, because when we are facing a common challenge, normally we get united, but after that we get more relaxed in action, although we talk a lot of good rhetorics in the world. So for the Iranian issue, I think this is pose immediate threat to Europe. So that's something very different to what is really there for the United States. And also Iran is situated between Europe and the Asia. So therefore there is really a common interest that target over there. And plus that ideologically both Europe and China are really defending for the world peace and the multilateralism. So therefore it is time after Donald Trump decided to move the other way for the two biggest economies and two biggest political unities to really work hand in hand towards a common issue that can be addressed.
Right. One could probably hear the siren sound in the background of some of the other guests. I hope it is a warning that we are running out of time when it comes to the right things to do. But having said that, though, the right thing, what exactly is the right thing, Mr. Begg? I mean, we are in a very delicate situation, as Professor Toker earlier articulated. About trade, for example, there are several things going on. United States and the EU,
yes,
at the WTO, there is a trade dispute, and it seems that the WTO is ruling toward the U.S. side for now. Second, United States and China have been in trade discussions, if not in trade disputes, as we have witnessed over the past few months. Thirdly, we also see NAFTA, for example, is still in the process of being negotiated just a few days ago in Mexico City. Meanwhile, other initiatives are also being hotly debated. So it seems that we do not have anything right now, Professor Begg, that countries can hold on to.
I think you're
Go ahead, sir.
I think you're correct, and the big challenge coming up, particularly for the Europeans, is that the period of grace during which Trump said he would not impose tariffs on aluminium and steel against European companies is very soon coming to an end. And if they start to become difficult about something like Iran, or if the Europeans keep insisting on preserving the Iranian deal, Trump is going to say, well, What about my commitment to NATO? There are all these implicit threats in the background that Trump can use, the Americans can use. Now, I think the saving grace in all of this is that we know that Trump, on the one hand, makes promises and keeps them, but also changes his mind quite quickly. So it's just possible that what we'll see is, if you prolong the negotiations with Iran, keep Iran from doing something rash like restarting its centrifuges, then there's the possibility for dealing with some of these other things on a slow pace.
Right.
And maybe banking on the fact that 1.5 years into the Trump presidency means only 2.5 years to go.
But, Professor Tolker, here's the thing. Are China, the EU countries, and some of the others, are going to be forever reactive to whatever Washington is doing? Or it is likely, from now on, to a certain extent, proactive about finding some solutions to the existing deadlocks and challenges, Professor Tolker? Some argue you cannot rely on the United States anymore. Some argue, well, it is still the biggest power in the world. You have to look at it, what it's doing.
Well, this is really a long-haul, long-range question. You may or may not consider that you can rely anymore on the United States position, and still that should not be enough in order to make other major superpowers work together to a level which would be ultimately, optimally satisfactory. That is to say that small steps in that direction, for example, regarding China and the EU, would be extremely constructive, although they might not change and alter the overall balance of power because of the U.S. Status as by far the first economic and military power on earth. So this is to put in correlation with what my colleague in London just said, namely, don't forget that there are U.S. internal developments that are knocking on our doors. Don't forget that there are midterm elections in America in about 6 months. Don't forget that the overall status of the Trump presidency, for reasons that have nothing to do with any of the issues we have dealt with, are sort of shaky, to say the least. So we can have a surprise on that part, which would make even more sense for that energy which should be invested by major partners such as EU, in spite of the difficulties, and China, in order to create somehow a more feasible overall balance.
Professor Liu, there are initiatives brought up by different sides about maybe some way forward besides what we have seen already existing and debated, questioned by the United States. For example, China's Belt and Road Initiative. I understand, well, in France, Chinese State Councillor Wang Yi did present the achievements of the Belt and Road Initiative since Chinese President Xi Jinping raised the idea 5 years ago. If you take a look at this, in the past half-decade, China's investment to BRI countries has exceeded $60 trillion. Direct flights to 43 countries have been operational, and 75 economic cooperation zones have been opened, creating 200,000 jobs. That is just one slice of many of the things happening between China and many of the European countries. So, Professor Liu, here's the thing. Will these kinds of initiatives be able to win enough hearts and trust so that they can serve the purpose as they have been created?
Well, I think Mr. Wang Yi's visit is very important at this critical moment for promoting the Belt and Road, but before which to build a better understanding and empathy over what is being proposed. So that's why China emphasizes this is not really a Marshall Plan, and there's no aggressive edge in there. So it is there. It's only China's initiative that that can also involve the third country impact. So to develop the mostly on infrastructure and to promote trade and investment along the Belt and Road countries. And now the concept of Belt and Road has been expanded to far more countries and to far more projects that are involved. And this is a very pragmatic approach. So therefore, by convincing the Europeans to buy in this concept and also to bring about very effective and realistic projects that we can really work together, that's something very highly acceptable.
Pragmatism, Professor Beck, you know very well. Well, after traveling to China many times, is always the spirit that seems that the Chinese are very interested in embracing. In that spirit, how much do you think that China and the EU countries, including some of the key European countries, be able to do now? If not Belt and Road, do we have other alternatives with which platform that the countries can operate on?
Yes, I think there are a number of areas that we underestimate the degree to which there is common ground between China and European countries. They are, for example, on research. In many areas, the US has been a research leader. China and Europe are research followers to some extent, and they can collaborate in ways that can promote that kind of activity. A second is that the one very striking common phenomenon between China and Europe is aging of the population, which in turn requires social and political responses, where I know from in the past the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has been very interested in what's happened in Europe in reconfiguring welfare states to try to deal with this long-term challenge. The great difficulty in much of this, though, is that while we can see in Belt and Road and other forms of cooperation, economic partnerships, paving the way for long-term successful relationships between Europe and China, much of what's on the current agenda is very short-term. Trump, Korea, trade tariffs, climate change, all of these things are things that we want to be settled quickly. And this is where there's maybe a disjunction between the longer-term, potentially very successful collaboration between China and Europe and the shorter-term imperatives of dealing with, as I said before, a maverick in the White House.
Not only that, there seems to be another issue, Professor Toker, if I could be frank here. That is, it seems that the Europeans, as some say from other parts of the world, are not necessarily predictable when it comes to what exactly will be their policies and their attitudes. It seems a lot is a reflection of what Washington is doing, and therefore making it difficult for the others to have real partners for the longer term with the European countries. Whether that is a fair comment or not, I want to have your views, Professor Toker, and how should the European countries move from here? I understand the complexity about the EU countries. I understand every country has its own politics. I understand the long-term alliance relationship between the European countries and the United States. But now it seems that the world is changing, Professor Toker, as you articulatively pointed out earlier.
Well, unfortunately, I think that on the overall scale, your commentary, your judgment is rather true, is rather exact. This is one of the major obstacles right now, and it isn't new. It has been the case for at least one generation, but there were some hopes over the last 2 years, roughly, regarding the capacity of European members of the European Union, different European nations, big ones and small ones, to do some extra effort in order to increase the overall cohesion of the European Union. This has a lot of meaning in terms of European internal affairs, but it has a lot of meaning in terms of the other topics we have discussed up to now. For example, the capacity to create something constructive on the European-Chinese overall policies on the short and on the long run. For example, climate change, which has been mentioned, is an excellent combination of both short, medium and long-range sphere of action in which both the Chinese and the Europeans, even without a lot of cohesion, institutional cohesion amongst them, can go forward regardless, to some extent, to what might be the decisions and the fallouts coming from Washington.
But Professor Liu, you know, action speaks even stronger than words. And actions, there has to be efficiency about thinking about how to have ideas and what ideas, how to implement those ideas, Professor Liu.
Well, that's very important because that's why I think China adopted the pragmatic approach that, okay, before we really build full consensus over a number of issues, let's start with specific projects, like the nuclear project working in London and also many other projects along the Belt and Road. So this is really, showing a very new example. And plus, that particularly along the Belt and Road, because the Europeans had an old tradition with many of those Belt Road countries, and now China is really presenting a new picture. Well, China, by some is accused of the neo-colonization, but over the past few years, the fact that we noticed that the development of infrastructure, the variety of goods provided by Chinese people in those localities really prove that this is really action that is really beat rhetorics.
Efficiency, efficiency, and efficiency. Professor Beck?
Well, yes. I think the difficulty we have is that if you go out in the street here next to me and say, what do you know about China's Belt and Road policy? You'll be met with a blank stare. And many British, European and other politicians will be saying to themselves, well, yes, there is something we know about, it's a big infrastructure project, but it doesn't really influence our way of thinking about how to deal with China. So there may be something of a disparity here between the Chinese pursuit of efficient trade, your efficiency, 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 and the political dimension of this, which is somehow lost in the way in which so many of our political leaders confront these big global challenges. China, I would have to say, is on the right side in many of these debates, but I don't think its influence is as much as you might hear in Beijing.
Professor Beck has put it in a very diplomatic way. Therefore, communication is extremely important. But will communication be able to solve the problem? That is still a huge question mark, given the very different history, different political systems, and the trust issue for a long time. Professor Liu, very briefly from you before we wrap up.
Well, yes, there are many channels for communication, but as you say, that action really speaks louder than the words. So let's, work together and roll up our sleeves and do something together. So China is already participating in many of the infrastructure projects, even in Europe, and also China is highly committed to the climate change. So this is something that they're improve. I think Europeans are also learning as how to cooperate with China in terms of infrastructure and in terms of technology and investment.
We're going to see what's going to happen in the future. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Ian Beck, Joab Toker, and Liu Baocheng. Thank you. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight on CGTN. Still to come on the program. Former French Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin is emphatic about the course of global trade and cooperation. European projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. We'll interview right after. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Trade disputes have been the top stories over recent months. Earlier, I talked to Jean-Pierre Raffarin, the former French Prime Minister. On open trade and global cooperation, Monsieur Raffarin was extremely firm and outspoken. He also praised the momentum of European projects with the Belt and Road Initiative. Let's listen in to what he had to say. China-U.S. trade dispute. Mr. Prime Minister, what do you make of the latest round?
We think that protectionism is not a good way in such a dangerous world. We need to have agreement, we need to have dialogue, and we don't like that one country take alone decisions against another. We think that we have to answer with multilateral dialogue. That's a subject about what Mr. Macron talked with President Xi. And I think they agree we need to have multilateral dialogue to discuss this situation.
But Mr. Prime Minister, people say, well, the European countries could be quite tricky in a way, because if heavy tariffs are being levied on Chinese goods while the Europeans are being exempted by the Americans from the heavy tariffs, then the Europeans, when they become realistic, they could just watch whatever is going on and never say a word.
That's a bad situation. We can't have one president, Mr. Trump, who is decided alone what happens with the world trade. We need to have cooperation. We need to discuss together. That's the reason why we have answered to the United States that we want to discuss in a multilateral size and not only bilateral discussion.
You mean, Mr. Prime Minister, even though the American, for example, the Trump administration give, let's just say French, exemption from the heavy tariffs, you will still proceed with a multilateral platform. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's our position. We are thinking that we need a world agreement.
But what about within the European Union? We know some countries are very outspoken about this, like France. Other countries could be tricky. So will France be able to stand on its own, saying this is what we believe, or it has to come with a quote-unquote consensus coming from the European Union, and then it becomes tricky?
I think that nowadays Mr. Macron has leadership enough to explain to his partners that we need to have multilateral discussion. And it could be a bad orientation to decide inch by inch.
People have been saying tariffs is a tool back in the 1980s. Remember, Mr. Prime Minister? But today, it has been very different when it comes to the world order and the way people interact with one another. So is tariff the way, or there should be much more inspirational ideas in order to solve what we have today?
Mr. Macron gives a good answer. We need to have a balanced cooperation. We need to have trade cooperation, and this cooperation must be balanced. We have to decide a lot of steps to have, in turn, balanced cooperation. And we can't have only short-term discussion. We need to have a long-term vision.
But the U.S. midterm election is just a few months from now.
Yes,
the presidential election is only 2 years from now. So I'm not sure they're with you about that reason.
Yes, I think that that's the reason why Mr. Trump is on a wrong way, because we need to have a balanced world. We need to have multipolarity. We need to have a balanced trade. So it's not possible to have a balanced trade in short term. We need to take decision for the future to reach a good situation, which is a balanced trade.
You remember, Mr. Prime Minister, with your political wisdom and also your knowledge of history, at the very beginning of the 20th century, in the 1930s, we have seen once again in the 1980s, issues like that, trade protectionism popped up, which all led to certain kinds of, first of all, the First World War, the Second World War, and certainly a Cold War. So now we see the protectionism rise again. People wonder, what would all of this mean for us, short term, and even more fearful about the long term?
The reason why the world is very dangerous right now. We have a lot of tensions, we have a lot of wars everywhere, we have terrorism, and we can't have, with now the news, we can't have economic war everywhere. So we need to share what we can call the consensus of Teng. We need reforms and we need openness. I have seen how China is becoming again a great country with reforms and openness. Nowadays, every country needs to make reforms, but we need openness. It's stupid to make reforms and to close the borders. We need to be open, and that's the reason why we have a very important growth in China for the last years. It's the reason of the opening economy. And now it's very strange, but Deng Xiaoping, 40 years after his decision for China, is a good vision for everywhere.
But now the complaint is the WTO is not moving fast enough to catch up with all the changes. That we all know. But the question is how? How to make that balance? On the one hand, you rely on international platforms, which tends to be slow, because you need to consult. But on the other hand, you really have urgent issues to resolve.
It's a very difficult question, but we know that we can choose the scenario of the past. We know that with nationalism, with protectionism, and with terrorism, and so on, at the end, we have war, we have fights, so we can't take this way. So we have to work together. That's the reason why France and China have agreed to have multilateral solution. Right now, the bilateral policy is the main policy everywhere. Mr. Putin has discussion with Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Trump wants to make the war with Mr. Xi, and so on everywhere. It's not possible to have a world of peace with only bilateral interests. We need to have a multilateral discussion. We need to have win-win cooperation. That's the reason why Belt and Road Initiative, for me, is an initiative for financial question, for infrastructures, for economic problems, but it's a project for peace.
And you also heard from China that in the next years, Chinese, according to the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, once a week ago in a speech, is likely to purchase 8 trillion worth of goods from all over the world in order to balance the trade and also in order to contribute, and of course to change China's economic structures too. How much opportunity do you think that would provide, in a way, about the structural changes, reform, and opening up that we talked about earlier for the other countries?
Firstly, is an answer to the United States. And we can't have a discussion which is only between 2 big nations. And when this decision has been taken, Mr. Macron has called Mr. Xi, and he has called also Mr. Trump, and he said, discuss together in this situation. We need to have a discussion at a large scale. So I think that China has no solution if they don't take such a decision, because they have to answer, but it's a short-term answer. We have to organize the discussion right now.
Belt and Road Initiative, many people see it in 2 layers. One, their interaction with China. The other thing is much more multilateral than just with China, because it's a platform everybody could talk to each other and cross-talk in a way. How do you think this will provide some immediate opportunities for countries, whether large or small, Mr. Prime Minister?
It's a bit difficult because we need to have an European answer, because we have a plan, for example, for infrastructures. It's called the Juncker plan, and we make a lot of investment in infrastructure. So we have to coordinate what we organize with the Juncker plan and what we can do with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that in the beginning of July, we will have a common answer from the European Commission about Belt and Road Initiative and the participation of Europe, with a good coordination between our own investments and the investments in the initiative of Mr. Xi.
So from now to July, not very long time, I'll have to say,
Yes,
Mr. Prime Minister, when it comes to drawing up with a plan. So what is that last mile for the European Union to come up with a consensus? What is it about?
We have already organized a work. For example, in my country, I am in charge of discussion with industrial people, with regions, with a lot of actors to find some big projects in infrastructures to propose to the Chinese to invest together. So I think we will be ready at the beginning of the summer to propose some initiative to our partner in Belt and Road Initiative.
Do you think there will still be enough momentum among those countries, France included, to participate and push forward with even more efficiency about the plan?
If we can choose good projects.
Yes.
We don't need to have a global discussion.
What is a good project for you?
I think good project is project which is already engaged between France and China and with companies who are working together already. And they can develop this project on the road. Some project. I think we need to have concrete discussion, not theoretical discussion. What we want to do.
Yes.
Are you agree with my project or not? If you are agree,
Actions.
Actions.
You are a fan of always studying governance, lifelong learning about governance. You even read the book of Chinese President Xi Jinping talking about governance. You even took some notes about that too, and compare notes with the Chinese President Xi Jinping when you saw him last time. I wonder what was his response to you?
These books are very important. Why? Because Mr. Xi writes what he wants to do. That's the reason why I have said many times China is predictable. The 19th Congress is not a surprise. We have seen what the President wants to do, and we have seen what he has written, and we have seen a lot of signal of his action. So I think that the distance of humanity, Belt and Road Initiative, that's not new ideas. The fight against corruption, that's not a new idea.
Right.
That's a very clear strategy. In a few years, Mr. Xi is becoming a world leader. He is a leader, and he has a very strong leadership.
Mr. Prime Minister, you've been a leader, and you have always been one who's cultivating the governance styles. I want to ask you, what kind of leadership do we want in our world today? Because we see the style of leadership in the current White House. We also see the style of leadership in different parts of the world, of course in China as well. What kind of leadership do you think, Mr. Prime Minister, at the dramatic change time that we need?
We need to have leaders with projects, and not only for their country, but for every country. I think that now we need to have cooperation against war. We need to have international cooperation. That's the reason why protectionism is the wrong way. We need to have international cooperation against war. And for having international cooperation, we have to propose projects. You know, Belt and Road is a big project, of course for China, of course for Asia, but also for other countries. And that's a very big 1,000 billion of dollars. It's something like 10 more than Marshall Plan in the past. So it's very important. And it's a project for corporations against war. Right. And the leaders nowadays is a man who is able to propose to the other projects which are good for his country, of course. Everybody has to work for his country and for his people, but also for the other.
That was my interview with Jean-Pierre Raffarin, the former Prime Minister of France. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and in Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.